Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City. Good evening if you are in Stoke-on-Trent or Pesaro in Italy, birthplace of my favorite opera composer, Gioachino Rossini, who was born yesterday, in other words, February 29th. He was born in 1792. So he only has a birthday once every 4 years. We have to make it special. By my calculation, yesterday he turned 58 years old, which means that he's still quite young, and he's younger than I am. But I wanted to have on this very special leap year day of Rossini's birthday, someone who has bathed in Rossini, has swum in all the Rossini rivers and lakes and vineyards that one can go to. And that is the wonderful tenor Barry Banks, who is a Rossini specialist. He's a great, thrilling singer, and we were going to talk about some of his roles today. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And Adagio, for those of you listening who are members, has a massive collection of Rossini music. And it's really the wonderful place for you to go and immerse yourself in there. But Barry Banks, thank you so much and happy Rossini's birthday.
Happy Rossini's birthday to everyone listening.
How did you celebrate yesterday on the birthday?
I actually did a little research on Rossini. I'm doing some teaching for Peabody Conservatory.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's always interesting to think of things to be able to give to young tenors. And everybody tends to give Ecco Ridente.
From Barbiere di Siviglia.
From Barbiere di Siviglia. But it's actually one of the most difficult arias to sing.
It is.
So I'm one of these strange people who doesn't think that Ecco Ridente is good for young singers. So I like to take the slow, languorous sections before I get them to do coloratura. And even with coloratura, the Barbiere coloratura is not easy because it has leaps. It doesn't just flow straight. So it's been interesting to revisit that. But what was most interesting for me was looking at all the Rossini that I've ever sung in my career and having a think and memorize memories of where I sang them, the colleagues that I sang them with, the joy that I got from them, and the fact that when I got married, the signature cocktail was the Rossini.
Very nice.
And people didn't understand why. And I said, well, he's paid a lot of bills during my life.
Was Rossini music used for marching down the aisle?
It wasn't. There was no marching down the aisle because we got married outdoors in under a chuppah right on the end of Manhattan, Battery Park.
Okay.
Overlooking the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. So outdoors was not really conducive. So I'm an ex-trumpet player. So brass is one of my real joys. And so I got a brass quintet to play Entry of the Queen of Sheba.
That's good. Now, true story, even though it's not about Rossini, in the 1980s, I went to a wedding in which the bride marched down to the Triumphal March Maida and the groom from the Executioner's music from Tosca. And they were not even opera people. I mean, they were not opera singers. They're opera lovers, but they were not in the profession.
And that's fabulous. And that shows wonderful humor. The ringtone for my wife is, and occasionally it goes off in rehearsals. If firstly I don't put mute on, which I usually do, or if I'm waiting for something that might be important, and it's Darth Vader's theme from Star Wars. So when it happens, I always say, "Oh, that's my wife," and the whole room bursts
My
out.
outgoing music since we got on this was Leontine Price singing Dove Sono, Where Am I?
Ah, very good.
Since I was
Very
not
good.
at the telephone. So let's get back to Gioachino. Um,
Yeah.
People who know me well ask me, everyone asks me, who are the best of the three tenors? I always say Alfredo Kraus. And who is your favorite opera composer? Your favorite composer? What are your favorite operas? And I always say that I don't want to name just one, but I name 5 or 6 operas, and then I say every note written by Rossini. So it's not that there's one opera, and if I had to pick one, I guess I could, but I don't want to. Semiramide, but I don't want to. Because Guglielmo Tell, Italiano and Algieri, there are many that Tancredi, many, many, many that I could pick. Hermione, but every note written by Rossini. And when I answer that, and I mean this in all seriousness, I believe that each person has in him or her a certain blood type, a certain heartbeat, a certain energy, a certain rhythm. And Rossini's heartbeat, rhythm, whatever, corresponds to mine. And the only other composer who does that is Hector Berlioz, who was more or
Oh,
less a contemporary of Rossini, and they had orchestral things in common. They lived in France and had Italian fascination, but both of them somehow speak to me in a very particular way physically. I just feel, I feel Hector, I call him Hector. I feel Hector's music much more physically deeply. Whereas with Rossini, I feel completely in sync. It's as if every note is right.
an interesting, a
Yeah,
little side note, and something that links to that. When I describe William Tell, Guillaume Tell, and the opera to people who don't know it, I say it's not Rossini. Of course, it is Rossini, but the one that it speaks to mostly to me is the influence of Berlioz.
yeah,
There's some sweeping orchestral things that, and to me, it's much more akin to Berlioz. Asile
I agree.
Hérédité, for instance, Asile has a lot of that influence in it. And so it's interesting for me to hear you say that.
Also, when I have to defend Rossini, which is all the time,
Mm-hmm.
um, I usually point out I can take almost any of his operas and show how those operas influenced Verdi, Wagner, Donizetti, all the composers who came after, and Rossini was way ahead of his time. And not just Guillaume Tell and Semiramide, but also Italiano and Algieri is a perfect example. To me, it's a
Yeah.
perfect opera um, of an opera that profoundly influenced what came after. And interestingly, it premiered on the day that Wagner was born.
And it also premiered on the day that I was born.
You were born in 1813?
On the date that I was born. No, no, no,
May
Fred, behave.
22nd.
May 22nd, which may be, and yeah, I was born on that date. Wagner, Italiana, and my singing teacher Joseph Wood.
Very
Uh,
good.
Joseph was born on May 22. So I have a lot of affinity with May 22. Funnily
I
enough.
can imagine. I'm May 10th.
Ah,
Yeah. So I think I'll tell you where I want to begin.
yep.
You were born in Stoke-on-Trent. I imagine that's somewhere north of London, as most
It
things are.
yep. It did right. Yeah.
Talk
It
about
it
Stoke-on-Trent. It sounds
it.
lovely.
Well, it's far from lovely, or it's lovely. Parts of it are lovely now. When I was, it was very much an industrial city. Uh, Although Stoke-on-Trent is uh, mixed up of literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little villages and 5 towns. And there was an old book by Arnold. I think it's Arnold, called Anne of Five Towns, and it's about Victorian life in Stoke-on-Trent. Stoke-on-Trent itself was the home of pottery, so it's known as the potteries. And so at the turn of the 20th century, it was very much a black town. I remember all going into the towns from our village.
Black as in pollution and cold.
Black as in the sandstone buildings were black.
Yeah.
And it's because there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of what they call bottleneck kilns.
Mm-hmm.
The kilns were outside, they were in the shape of a bottle to take the smoke up. And there are some amazing historical photographs of all what they call the pot banks, the pottery works, all firing at once.
Mm-hmm.
And the pall of smoke over Stoke-on-Trent was just incredible. So I grew up there, and then latterly they cleaned it up. And the other thing around us was mining.
Yeah.
Now I grew up as a passionate brass bandsman. I was a cornet player, and not a bad cornet player. And the local pottery works, Royal Dalton, which is very, very famous for.
Right, which is what my association with Stoke-on-Trent.
Stoke-on-Trent is
lovely.
Royal Dalton had a brass band, a first division brass band, a top brass band. So I grew up with the brass bands, but I actually lived in the countryside. So where I lived was gorgeous, and my playground were miles and miles and miles of fields. I had, although I grew up in a very, very poor family, I didn't really know, because my childhood was joyous. And I didn't really know that we had no money at all until early teens. And then, and then my father died when I was 16. So that became even tougher. Mm-hmm. For my mom to bring up 4 or 5 kids. But the area of Stoke-on-Trent at that time was smoky, but where I was just field upon field. It's now, all those fields have gone and it's now houses, but like a lot of places.
What is the difference between a cornet and a trumpet?
A cornet is conical for 2/3 of its length. It's a shorter, fatter version. A trumpet is straight for a lot of, for the majority of its length, and therefore makes a brighter, harder sound. The cornet is a much mellower sound because of the shape.
Well, I grew up in New York City, and one of the first shows I saw on Broadway was the original Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand.
Wow.
And the song for an 8-year-old that most captured me was not Don't Rain on My Parade. It was a song called Cornet Man, which Blow It Like I Know It, Traveling Dapper Dan. He leaves his wife and Kitty sitting, hanging with their tongues out. You know he'd play for peanuts for a chance to blow his lungs out, and so on, so on, so on.
Wow.
The first time I heard it, the lyric embedded in my head the way nothing else in that show did. And Barbra Streisand, that was her first big number in the show. And that's what blew me away, not the big numbers we know that came later. So I've always focused on the cornet. I didn't play it. I played clarinet. But my dad was a professional trombonist. And what I'm getting to with you is my dad, not because he was my father, but he had the most gorgeous sound of the trombone. It was not a blaring, brassy, obnoxious sound. It was gorgeous. And he had the ability to play, Wagner or whomever, Richard Strauss, or Broadway shows or jazz or big band. But he also had a particular ability to, let's say he wanted to, quote, sing like Ella Fitzgerald or Louis Armstrong or Marilyn Horne. He would take his trombone and take the aria or the song and play it not with words, but he managed to get the sound of Ella, of Louis, of Marilyn out in the most gorgeous way. And what I'm leading to is the following. Rossini, more, in my view, more than any other composer, would invite that kind of performance from my father. But I wonder whether you're playing the cornet, and I imagine the trumpet as well, in any way connects to your Rossini singing.
Well, yes and no. What the cornet and the trumpet gave me was incredible, at the time, incredible breath control.
Mm-hmm.
And it developed I have it's interesting to look at singers physiologically. See, everybody knows I'm not the tallest of people, but I have a barrel chest. And I don't know whether that barrel chest is a result of playing the trumpet from the age of 10, 11 and going on, and then being a singer, or it was physiologically how I was built. I think it's probably a mixture of both.
It's not ego.
But your father, going back to your father, you said he had the most gorgeous sound.
He did.
He had that sound for one reason, and this links to singers. The only way you develop a beautiful sound on a brass instrument is to play long notes for days and days and days. That's how you develop a tone. And so when I'm teaching or advising people, and they come and the only thing they have in their repertoire is coloratura or fast, they hate me because I make them sing slow, because slow brings out all the problems. It shows where the problems are. And so, in a way, the link for me between Rossini and playing is I was lucky enough to become what they be called the principal cornet, which means you play all the solos in the band. So I was principal cornet in a couple of bands, including my county brass band, and it because I was playing the solos, and I used to love playing the slow solos. That's what taught me to spin a line, to spin a phrase, to know when to give and come back and give. And so I count my, if anyone thinks I'm musical, I count my musicality from my early trumpet days.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that the spinning of the long lines helped me tremendously in the spinning of the long Rossini, the slower sections.
When I talk to singers, I always love to ask what instrument they played or studied, because that tells me so much about their approach to singing.
Yeah.
If someone played the cello, for example, you just know about their breath tones, about how they sustain a sound, how they complete a sound, a note or whatever. But if someone perhaps played the trumpet, you could imagine them doing 16th notes in Rossini.
Yes. Although the great trumpet players, when you and the one that I will quote here, Håkan Hardenberger,
Mm-hmm.
there's a disc of him playing the Hummel and the Haydn, and they're good. But for me, the standouts are the Hertel and the Stamitz, because he sounds like an oboe. It's so beautiful. So yes, we all know the we all know those. But it's how you're able to spin that long line, the continuous breath through it, if that makes sense.
It does. So,
But yes, doing the coloratura and doing double and triple tonguing is definitely akin to each other.
when you were studying singing, at what point and how did Rossini come into your life?
Late. Well, late. I mean, I went to I actually auditioned at 2 conservatories as a trumpet player, and I got into 2 conservatories as a trumpet player. And in Britain, I don't know if it's the same anymore, but you had to have 2 instruments. You couldn't just have one. You had to have 2. And so I'd been in the youth choir since I was 13. And so I said, oh, singing. So I toddled off to my now let backtrack. In Britain, as an instrumentalist, we have to do certain examinations. They go from grades 1 to grade 8, and after grade 8 you're really quite proficient, and then you go on to. So I discovered that somebody discovered that I could sing a little. So I took my grade 8 trumpet and my grade 8 singing in the same week. And I'd been playing trumpet for years, and I loved it. And I got a pass on my trumpet and a distinction on my singing, even though I'd only been singing for a couple of months. And the sight reading ear tests were so easy to me because I'd been reading for so long. And so that was the first indication. And so, but for that examination, for that grade 8 examination, I had to learn 3 songs. Delius to Daffodils, Comfort Ye in Every Valley from the Messiah, and the third was La Donna. And so I sang my 3 and got my distinction. And so when I got into these 2 conservatories, I had to audition singing. So I sang those. And then my trumpet teacher, wonderful man, and I wouldn't be here without him, Wilson Hawkins, and I wouldn't be here without my high school music teacher, John Challoner. They're both instrumental in me being where I am. Wilson said to me, "You're a good trumpet player, but I don't think you've got that extra 1% that you need to be a pro." And he was right. I was lazy. I was lazy. Well, I was lazy when it came to scales and arpeggios. He told me that my scales and arpeggios came from the school of Ravi Shankar. So he said, I think you should.
So you were playing ragamuffins.
Raga, but So he persuaded me to do an audition at his alum, which was the Royal Northern College of Music. And I went and I took my trumpet. And when I got there, they said, "What's that? My trumpet?" "Nope. School of Wind Percussion auditions closed 2 weeks ago. You're here for a singing audition." So they sent me for an advice audition to see if I warranted a full audition. And I walked into this gentleman's room, and I was in a 3-piece, 70s 3-piece suit, or early 80s. and tie and everything. And I obviously looked so uncomfortable because the silver-haired gentleman who I was with said, "Take your jacket off." And then he said, "Do you want to take your waistcoat off?" And I went, "Yes, please." And then he eventually said, "Do you want to lose the tie?" So I obviously looked uncomfortable. And I sang my 3 songs. And he said, "Yes, I think you should come for a full audition. But next time, when you come back, could you sing La Donna e Mobile in the correct key?" I'd been singing it a 4th down.
Ah.
So for the full audition, I learned to sing it. And that man, by the way, that silver-haired gentleman who said that I should go for a full audition, was the great English tenor Alexander Young.
Aha. Wow.
And who historically, this is down in Stravinsky's own writing. He wrote the Rake's Progress with
Yes.
Alexander Young's voice in his head.
And it's a role you've sung, Tom Rickwell.
And it's a role that I was so lucky enough to go through with Alexander Young.
Wow.
So I went to for a full audition, and I don't know how. I must have had a natural aptitude because I was able to sing La Donna and get the high notes. But I didn't do Pensier because that's what I didn't know anything about singing or opera. So I just sang what was written on the page. And then I was offered a place, and my trumpet teacher said, I don't think you've got the 1%. Why don't you go to college and see how the singing goes? So I did.
Mm-hmm.
But I came from a very, very big family. Very big family. There were 3 boys and 2 girls. And the 3 boys slept in one bed because we had a tiny. And so when I went to college, I was excited to have my own room for the first time in my life. And when I got there, I was one of only 8 people to be sharing a room. And I was devastated, but it was the best thing that happened to me because that man was a trombonist by the name of Graham Boyd. And so I joined the college brass band, and I joined all the brass players. So for 2 years, I didn't really concentrate on singing. I wasn't really interested. But then things overtook, and I then became very serious about singing. But I think that those 2 years, because when I got to college, I was incredibly intimidated by all the other singers because they all knew about song. They all knew about opera. They all knew about the roles in the operas, and I knew nothing. I knew 3 songs. When I went to conservatory, I knew 3 songs, and they were the songs that I sang for my grade 8 audition.
So who handed you Delius? I'll tell you why I ask. I was named for 3 Fredericks. One of them you would not know. It was important to my mother. The other, everyone knows, is Fred Astaire. But my father insisted that it be on Frederick Delius.
Oh, wow.
And my name is spelled as he spelled his Frederick.
Yes, it is.
And not too many Americans are named for Frederick Delius.
No.
But I may be the only one.
I first encountered Delius, and I thought he was massively difficult to sing.
Yeah.
There is a choral work, and it has a title. And it was when I was in the youth choir, and it has a tenor solo in it to ooh, and it's called A Song to be Sung on a Summer Night on the River, or A Song to be Sung on a Summer Night on the Water.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that incredibly difficult. The reason I got given the Delius is when you do your grade 8 pieces, you get a choice of 5 pieces to sing. And I think one has to be an oratorio, so that was Company in Every Valley. One has to be an opera, and one has to be a song.
Mm.
So that I just chose the to daffodils, but it was far more 20th century, shall we say, than I'd ever encountered before.
Right.
But I did love it, but I felt it was incredibly difficult.
It is. He's difficult. I think that's part of why we don't hear him too much.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
he's not easily classifiable, and many people think they have to classify someone to perform him.
Yeah.
But Delius cannot be, Florida Sweet is because he was in the family orange business is not enough to go on. But at what point did Rossini come in? Because
Rossini,
I think Rossini's the hardest singer of all music of all to sing for an opera singer.
well,
Wagner is a walk in the park compared to Rossini. It's a
yes,
big park. It's a forest.
we'll come to that. We'll come to the Wagner later. So I had this sweet light voice, and I had my first singing teacher, and he, believe it or not, we did song, and because I didn't know any song, we started with song and O del mio dolce ardor, and then he gave me my first operatic song, and it was Come Gentile,
Mm-hmm.
and I was
From Don
19.
Pasquale.
And Don Pasquale,
Yeah.
which is usually sung off stage, but I was 19 and I didn't have a clue, and it was very high. And the exciting news for in the college's mind was they had a tenor who had high notes, but I may have had a high notes, but I didn't know how to go there.
Mm-hmm.
So people would ask me after my singing lesson, "How was that?" And I would say, "Yeah, it was good." And I would be voiceless. So I got to be very, very, very scared of Donizetti and also his boys. So I didn't sing any. My first operatic role was Don Ottavio at college, and then I went to my singing teacher, who gave me the technique that I have today. An incredible man called Joseph Ward. And for your listeners, if they want to do a little research on him, he started life off as a baritone. He was the first Cid in Albert Herring.
Ah.
He was the first televised Billy in Billy Budd. And he was the first starveling in A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very, very good career. And then he worked with Schulte. And Schulte said, "I think you're a tenor." And so he did some tenor work, and he became the most amazing tenor. And he worked a lot with Joan Sutherland and Pavarotti and the Carla Rosa Opera Company.
Mm-hmm.
And he used to alternate roles with Pavarotti for quite a few years. And if your singers want to hear his tenor singing at its very greatest, there is a recording of Karl Heinrich Graun's Montezuma.
Mm-hmm.
And he is brilliant with Joan Sutherland.
Mm-hmm.
And he is brilliant on it, absolutely brilliant. And he very proudly used to tell me, "Yes, and I did those arias all in one take." So he was the one. I walked in, and before that, people had treated me like an English tenor, which is, as you know, a very different beast.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked in for my first lesson with Joe, and he said, "I think you're an Italian tenor. And I think you could be an Italian tenor. And I'm going to teach you as an Italian tenor."
Mm-hmm.
And so he started getting me to use these tones. And I had a natural coloratura at that time. And he did get me to do Ecco Ridente. And then in my final year at college, oh no, the year before I left, so I was in my fourth year, college did the Barber of Seville. And that was my first entrance into Rossini.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned it so well because I was at college that from that point on, I would only ever need 1 or 2 days to get Barbiere up and running again because I'd done so much work on it when I was at college. And it seemed to fit. It
Mm-hmm.
just seemed to fit. I'd done Tamino, and I loved that.
In the Magic Flute, yep.
In the Magic Flute, I'd done Tamino, and Joseph Ward was directing it. And I did Barbiere, and I think Joseph Ward directed that too. He was a man of many talents. And it was during that, so that would be 1983, 84. And it was during that that people said, this is your future.
Mm-hmm.
And I needed some convincing.
Mm-hmm.
But what it also told me was that I was a stage animal. I'd never had any
You
stage.
very much are. I can attest to that, having seen you perform countless times, that not everybody who sings opera is a stage animal. Miss Sutherland, who I adored, was not a stage animal, but she didn't have to be.
No.
She was the greatest singer there was, and
Yeah.
therefore, just sing it, Joan, and that was all you needed.
Yeah.
And she had a lot of charisma and presence. So, like Kiri Takanoa does not really have to act. She can act, but she has such a natural presence that she can stand there and produce beautiful sound, and that's sufficient. Whereas most opera singers, if they can also act to some degree or a greater degree, that really helps because opera is theater too. And I'm going to get very specifically to the fact that Gioachino Rossini, among the things that I love about him is that he wrote in every operatic style. People think of him for the comedies. He wrote dramas, melodramas, uh, all kinds of definitions. In fact, I wrote down a few. Um, Tancredi, these are all roles or operas you've sung in, is a melodrama eroico. In other words, a heroic melodrama. L'Italiano in Algeri is a drama giocoso, which is sort of a joyous drama. Il Turco in Italia is a drama buffo. In other words, a more comic drama, but it's a drama. Elizabeth Regina d'Inghilterra, Elizabeth the First of England, is just a drama. Il Barbiere di Siviglia is a commedia. Um, Otello is a drama because Rossini wrote Otello before Verdi did. La Cenerentola is a drama giocoso. In other words, what is sometimes called a comédie larmoyante in French. In other words, a comedy, but where you might shed a tear. La Gazza Ladra, a melodrama.
Now that's the one that interests because Gatta Ladra, there's a lot of humor in Gatta Ladra.
But nonetheless, Rossini called it a melodrama.
Melodrama.
Armida is a drama. To me, it's a horror show. uh, whereas Mosè in Egitto, Moses in Egypt, is the best title of all. Un'azione tragico sacra, a tragic sacred action or act. Ermione is un'azione tragica, tragic action. La Donna del Lago, melodrama. Bianca melodrama. Semiramide, melodrama tragico. In Viaggio Rems, drama giocoso. Le Conterie, opera bouffe. And he changed it. He added an accent over the E. In Guillaume Tell, it's opera. So it's not those Italian definitions. He used opera in French to describe Guillaume Tell. So therefore, and those are the 18 operas of Rossini you've sung in. But they're all in different styles.
Yes,
And they all
yes,
have different tones and colors and flavors and
yes.
so on. And he's hardly the monolithic, um, bubbly composer that people mistake him for.
But this and it must frustrate you so much when people dismiss him because of that. Um, for instance, an unknown someone who doesn't know Guillaume Tell, they would listen. They listen to the overture. The overture has no bearing whatsoever on what happens in the rest of the opera,
Mhm.
and that's the first surprise that people will get
Yeah.
when because they think it's this flighty thing. Now the beginning of the overture is different, but when they get to the famous part, it has no bearing on the rest of it. Totally, and it does. I I'll it narrows the mind of people in casting.
Hmm.
It narrows the mind of people in the listening. Like I don't like Rossini, so I'm not going to go to listen to it. But the casting one is worrying because they don't know. But it it I recorded a few years ago. I recorded an Elgar piece called. Nobody in America knows it. Some people in America know The Dream of Gerontius.
Hmm.
Some people. Nobody knows scenes from the life of King Olaf.
I do.
Ah,
I'll
now
tell
do
you why. Very briefly, I'll tell you why. I was in the New York City Children's Choir,
choir.
sang that at Carnegie Hall, and I had the solo.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there is a
So I
chorus.
actually,
The chorus. They did it in Carnegie, and you sang. You
this would
sang it
be
in
about
Carnegie.
1968, 69. Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
It is a rarely. I don't. I've only ever known. Actually, I've never known it done in concert apart from the one that I did in Bergen.
Yep.
And so I, uh, the wonderful late Philip Langridge had recorded it, but that recording was obsolete. It
Hmm.
had been taken. So we recorded it maybe 7, 8, 9 years ago, something like that. And we had concerts, and then we had to go back 2 weeks later to record it. And it's a big stentorian thing for the tenor, amazing. And afterwards, the orchestral manager said to me, "Wow, Barry, after this, Mahler 8 must be a breeze for you." And I said, "I don't know because I've never done it." And he went, "You've never done it?" And then he went, "Ah, I suppose people still think you're a Rossini singer." And he didn't mean it dismissively, but it did point to what people think of
Yeah.
Rossini singers,
Yep.
or the narrow way that people think of Rossini singers. And
I mean, I think the people who don't understand him and his music, and therefore the people who perform him, think of it as the emission of notes rather than singing. And that if you could manage to emit those notes in the right key and at the right speed, and Marilyn Horne used to joke with me all the time that I know my 16th, my 32nds, my eighth notes, and I hit them all. And but she was joking because obviously she knew it was about singing and not just hitting those notes. But in addition, she could hit all of those notes as written. But she and Beverly Sills and a lot of singers all understood this as singing. Maria Callas sang Il Turco in Italia in her way, and it was singing. And ultimately, I mean, Shirley Verrett sang Rossini, and that's not what people associate her with, but she sang Rossini and Montserrat Caballé, obviously. But all these great, great singers sang Rossini and a whole bunch of tenors. and baritones, and Samuel Ramey as a bass, and a few others. But everyone said, well, Sam Raimi could do that, but he could also do Boris Godunov. He can do Fiesco, and he can do anything, and it's true. But the fact that he could do Rossini, to me, is harder and more, not more commendable, but more remarkable than the fact that he could do Boris Godunov.
Yeah, it's and historically, singers who can do both, although Sam could, it tends to be that when they go to the big stentorian stuff, they might not be the most ideal person for that role. Whereas, let's take the bass in Italian, we're talking basso cantante.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who's the great basso cantante who's been singing for many, 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 many years now? Did Sonnambula with me at the Met, and oh,
Luca Pizzaroni has not been singing that
no,
long.
no,
Lucio Forlanetto,
no, not although I
Paolo
did sing.
Montarsolo.
No, he basically only did. I'm going to have to look that one up now. He's done all the basso cantante, and he has such a cantabile sound. But I think latterly he's going into bigger rep now, so I'm going to have to find his name. But the people who do the Rossini and those big things might not have the voice that anyone thinks of for the big stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I look at someone like my brain has now gone for. I did my debut at Covent Garden in Pagliacci, and
Beppe.
Capuccilli.
Piero Capuccilli, okay.
Capuccilli
Was a baritone.
The most incredible, godlike voice.
Yep.
The likes of which come around once in a generation or two. His sound for when I was singing Donizetti, when I was singing one of the Queens, not the Queens, but and he's on the recording, it is just glorious.
Yep.
But and he could refine his voice. We've lost a little of that refinement now, where you can lean into the big sound but also do the refinement, and that's something that Sam could do.
Definitely. In my early training, after Lyric Opera Chicago was my first theater, I then worked in Italy and I studied there. But then I was lucky to get a Fulbright and work at La Scala for 2 years, when Piero Capuccilli was basically the house baritone, and
Right.
Claudio Botto the house conductor. And we had, ladies like Morella Fredi, Montserrat Caballé, Shirley Verrett coming in and doing different productions. So the Capuccilli would do Nasro, he would do Simone Boccanegra, he would do Verdi's Macbeth, and so on. And one more gorgeous than the next.
And he just had that ability.
Yeah.
To Pertusi, Michele Pertusi.
Michele Pertusi, okay.
And Michele is doing big stuff now. But yes, he had that ability to be able to do the lot. Mm-hmm. But that's because he lived those roles. When you were on stage with him, talking about stage animal, and he was almost uncontrollable when he was on stage. He knew exactly what he was doing. And it was with working with those type of people that it's not Rossini, but with the when I was doing the Beppe, one day Vladimir Atlantov
mm-hmm.
and Piero were Vladimir sang the prologue and Piero sang Vesila Giubba.
Wow.
And it was mind-bogglingly brilliant. And he showed me two things: how to be aware of your singing and how not to be neurotic.
And this is a serious question,
yeah,
for a singer specifically. How does one not be neurotic?
I attribute to that part of my career and that part of my toolbox, because coping with this sort of thing, you have a toolbox. You have a toolbox of tricks to be able to pull on. That particular tool, I believe, because I was so in awe of the other singers at college, or not in awe, I was not in awe of them. I was intimidated by them. That I sank myself much further into the brass playing. And then when I saw the greats, and I was lucky enough to span those, when I saw the greats smoking, going out having a meal, but serious, for instance, Cappuccilli sang the very first performance of that production, Zeffirelli production of Pagliacci, 25 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He came into every rehearsal and sang out in every rehearsal.
Mm-hmm.
And he decided to take me and Simon Keenlyside under his wing.
Uh-huh.
He literally put his arm around both of us and just decided that we were going to learn from him. It was amazing.
But so did you ever do Tamino to Simon's Papageno?
I never did it on stage to Simon's Papageno. I did it on stage with
you were
Gerald.
both at the same school. That's
I
why
never did it on stage with Simon. Okay. I did it with Gerald Findlay.
Wow.
Okay. But I did record it with Simon.
Okay.
I recorded it with Simon. So yeah, so
back Piero to Piero. I just had to ask because I know you were all at the same school.
We're great friends. Yeah. I've done other things. In fact, we both did our Covent Garden debuts together. We both did our Met debuts at the same time. I think he was doing Bel Core and I was doing Flute and Midsummer's Dream. Mm-hmm. And we've met. Of course, he's like a brother to me. You know, he really is like a brother to me. So we always cherish when we do work together. So yeah, back to Piero. On opening night, this is how crazy he was. On opening night, I was nervous and getting myself together. And a pair of hands came from behind and grabbed my throat. And I turned around, it was Piero, and he just burst out laughing and ran down the hall. And on about the third or fourth performance, I ran on, and I'm just about to say, "E tu batti la casa, Tonio," and he got a look on his face, and I went, "Oh, that's odd." And just before I was to sing the line, he went, and he grabbed my throat. He grabbed me, and I lost it, and I hit his hands away, and I grabbed him, and I just went, "E tu batti la casa, Tonio," and I threw him on the floor. I threw him, and I was so scared. And as he got up, I kicked his bum, and I kicked him all the way off stage. And when I got off stage, I went, "What have I done?" And he picked himself up off the floor, dusted him down, turned and went, "Bravissimo."
Good. That's the point. Yeah.
He was testing me.
Yeah.
And I think it was with working with people like him and watching those greats who were just completely normal until they had to do it. It taught me a massive, massive lesson. And I think the people who, I can see it, interestingly, in its embryonic form whilst I'm teaching Peabody. When they think only about their throat and the sound that is coming out from it is when they're in trouble.
Yeah.
Um, I people ask me which is the greatest. The voice is the greatest instrument, or arguably, and for one reason, as an instrumentalist, your father would attest. It's what you pour into the sound and the instrument. Yes, there is a certain histrionics that go with it, but you cannot overly do that. Clarinetists can, because they can do all of that.
Hello.
But we have the easiest and the hardest job. We have words.
Yeah.
We have words to be able to paint the color, to be able to form the shape of the phrase, to be able to be to be able to the onomatopoeia the onomatopoeia of it all, and be able to just caress those things or those words. And if it's all about where the throat is and making sure that it's the right sound, for a start off, what's the right sound? Our job is so subjective. Who says someone's sound or other is wrong? And it's really difficult to get them to get people to put that to the side. And so for me, that's a big problem.
So, given you're talking about this, I want to go further.
Yeah.
And we will get back to our friend Rossini. When you know that I coach singers, but I only coach them on the dramatic side, not how to sing. And some of them, the young singers I meet, tell me, I'm going to move my larynx this way, I'm going to move my diaphragm that way, or I'm going to bring my chords together. And they speak incredibly anatomically, as if they can summon and do all that stuff. And maybe they can envision it. But when they're thinking so much about how they're producing that sound, there's seldom room for me to coach them dramatically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's a problem that I'm encountering more and more. When I was asked to help out with Peabody, they'd lost two professors. Elizabeth Futrell asked me. Elizabeth was my first leading lady in America. She was my Cunegonda when I did my debut in America in Candide in Chicago. Yes,
I saw you do it.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. You know, there was a lot of controversy or controversy. I don't know what we say over here now. You see, it's yeah. I have a little girl. I have a 5-year-old girl and a New York wife, and so my little girl is bilingual because we have schedule, controversy. It was controversial because I was a Brit being given the iconic American role.
Except he's French.
Even though it was written by Voltaire.
He's French and he spends time in Portugal.
but because Bernstein wrote it, you know, yada yada yada. Anyway, and it was the Hal Prince production, and I sang, and Hal wasn't there for the first week, and I sang, and it was great, it was fine, and then it came to the dialogue, and I started to do the dialogue, and Hal's assistant, a wonderful man called Artie Marsala, and he literally did this when I started my dialogue. He said, and I stopped. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Gee, I don't know about the accent." So when Hal came for his first run through, Ardis Kranick was in the room, the wonderful Ardis Kranick. The entire company was in the talk about pressure because they thought that um, Hal was going to sack me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went up to him mid at the interval and said, "So what's the verdict?" So what do you mean? They seem to think because of my British accent, you're going. It's not. He said, "Are you kidding? It's a gold mine," and it really was because
Of course.
things like when the Russian lady said, "Would you tell me a story?" And I said, "Oh yes, please," stressing the lost buttock. And stressing the lost buttock doesn't have the same charm.
No.
And the audience just fell about every night because of stressing the lost buttock. And so
For people who don't know what we're talking about, this woman, this foreign woman, I always think of her as a Portuguese lady, is through some accident in some war, she lost one of her posterior cheeks. To put it that way. And
so
therefore limped about. And I once worked on a semi-stage production of that with Krista Ludwig as the Portuguese lady. And she was very droll and very funny because all she had to do was say the lines without trying to be funny, and she was very funny.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, what a voice.
Yeah,
So Elizabeth was my first leading lady, and so when she called me to ask to teach, the first thing out of my mouth was, "But I'm not a pedagogist."
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph Ward was not a pedagogist. And I teach half my own stuff and half the way Joe did it. At the time that I took singing lessons with Joe, the other two singers that he had many singers actually, but two of the names that the audience might know are Jane Eaglin was with him at exactly the same time, and a wonderful Mozart Russian singer, Joan Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
Joan, he had me, Joan, and Jane at the same time and taught three completely different voices.
Yeah, I mean, Jane Eaglin is Wagner and a little bit of Bellini.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. But there again, okay, you've made the link between bel canto and Wagner. We'll come back to that. But when I encounter people who are young students who are concentrating just on their voice or just on the placement, or as you said, I'm going to open my chords. I wouldn't be able to tell myself I'm going to open my chords. I wouldn't know how the hell to start with
Or I'm
that.
just going to use my left nostril.
This is a pedagogical approach, but there are only a couple of Peter Pears actually. Peter Pears was an exponent of the Hustler method, which is a pedagogical thing. There are a few people who've made it big who had method. But on the whole, for me, there's a disconnect between there and there.
Mm-hmm.
And there has to be that link.
Yep.
You've got to, I say to my students, technique is something that you work out in the rehearsal room, but once you're in a performance situation, that all has to go by the by.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you see it in the eyes, you see it in the face.
Yep.
They stop acting, they stop emoting. So when you encounter a singer who you're doing work dramaturgically with, you can't if all they're thinking about is how to link their left buttock to their right vocal cord. That's of course a facetious way of
But
now,
also, and I'm speaking both seriously but humorously, whether they're women or men, they speak to me with such anatomical candor about what they're doing and what they're squeezing, what they're pressing, what they're lifting, and so on, that it, I as someone who's not a singer by profession, and studied singing, not with the idea that I would become a singer, but to know what some of what you guys have to do. But Barry, I don't know if you, as you sing on the stage, imagine all this squeezing and moving and shifting that happens
No,
that some of these people tell me about.
because I will tell you that I practice what I preach.
Yeah.
In that by the time it comes to the stage, all that should have been worked out so that muscle memory then kicks in. Muscle memory is a great tool that singers need. And technique is something to be drawn on when you're sick.
Yeah.
But the technique, by the time you get to an opening night or on the stage, that should be second nature to your body. You've worked all that out in rehearsals or in a practice room. And yes, actually, let's take Fille de Régiment when I did it at the Met. I didn't have to think about Pour mon âme, but I did have to think about the high C sharp, the sustained C sharp in the second act aria, which, by the way, is the aria that sorts the men out from the
boys.
Yeah, yeah. And so, but hopefully that doesn't enter the face. It's just something that I want to be aware of. So no, when I'm on stage, I've hopefully, unless you're sick, that all gets left behind. Does that make sense?
It does. And since we're on the topic of teaching, you're summoning something to mind that I didn't plan to talk to you about, but that's why I love these conversations. We will get to our friend Rossini. About 10 days ago, I attended a performance with 5 young, very talented singers in a work I didn't know. And all 5 had a lot of talent. 4 of them were great singers, and one of them was not a great singer. He had a beautiful voice, and he was the best actor of the 5 by far. A wonderful, sensitive actor. But he had a beat and a vibrato and a forcing in his voice that, while I can't correct that, I went to the director because I was invited by the director to come hear these singers. And I said to the director, this young man has incredible gifts. He's a marvelous actor and charismatic, and he has a nice voice, but his singing is wrong, and I worry that you're not going to get to opening night with him having a voice. And someone needs to really sit down and talk to him. And I think that the director thought I was overstepping my bounds a bit, but I really did it out of concern for the singer because he just was a bad singer with a beautiful voice and all kinds of other gifts. Whereas the other 4 were so good as singers that they only created the contrast even more for me because the other 4 really had it in different styles, different voices,
Yes.
but they all, 2 women, 2 men, they all had it. And this guy just couldn't sing. If you were faced with something like that, what would you do if someone clearly has the gifts, but he doesn't have the proper training?
If they're young enough,
Yeah, he was.
you take them back to basics. You take them back to basics. I've done it with I've done it with a couple of mine, and I marvel at these people because it really is back to basics. It's as basic as teaching them how to breathe, as basic as teaching them how to open their lungs, breathe into their, teaching the intercostal muscles open wide so that they can have a breath control, teaching them to sing a legato line so that the fine column of air coming out stops the throat closing up. Teaching them where their support is, because far too many singers, their support is too high. Once it comes up under the solar plexus, you're in trouble. It's very, very much further down. Wanting to be, not wanting to be too And well, it is anatomical. It's just above the pubic bone and all
Yep.
the muscles there. The best, if there are any singers listening, young singers, the best way to find out where your support is to lie on the floor and lift both your legs up just 6 inches. Keep this all relaxed, and that will and hold that for 10 seconds and try and do that 10 times. The next morning, you will feel exactly where your
Krista
support.
Ludwig, when she taught, had people do that.
Oh, really?
Yep. I witnessed it. Yep.
Yeah, I've got all mine doing it, and they're all astounded when they find out where it is.
So since you went there, I'm going to go there too. There's a very famous retired singer. She's quite elderly now, of two previous generations, who still teaches. And I, about 6 years ago, taught in a program where I was doing the drama side, she was the vocal side. And we had this very lovely soprano who's gone on to a big career, a very religious young woman from a traditional religious background in the South of the United States, and not stuffy, not pretentious, but just very seriously religious. And this old artist who came from Pennsylvania just spoke with more candor and no BS. And she said to this lovely religious soprano from the South, honey, you got to sing from hairline to hairline. And the woman from the South said, ma'am, I'm not quite sure I know what you're saying. Honey, yes, you do. Oh
and,
boy.
and herein lies a little bit of a problem. I've not really encountered it in my teaching, but I did do a masterclass at a southern Midwest university,
Mm-hmm.
and they did the opening scenes of Magic Flute with the three ladies and Tamino.
Yep.
And I was not allowed to intimate sexual tension.
What the three ladies are talking about, what they're thinking about. Yeah.
Exactly what they're thinking about. And that's not for the audience, that's not me interpreting this. This is exactly
that
they
chickinator.
all want a piece of Tamino, but
Yeah.
I couldn't go anywhere near that because it was a religious school.
I know.
It's
yeah, I once worked on a production of Faust at a religious school. That was not easy. That was I had to imply what was being discussed.
Yeah. I mean, there are ways to do it, but yes, in a nutshell, young singers we have to find the connect between there and there is basically what we're looking at. There has to be knowledge of technique, of course there does, but we have to then link that, and if that throws that out of kilter, we have to then find a way of linking it and not going too far. It's the way of singing angrily without it hurting your voice.
Yep.
For instance.
So
there's the things.
I just thought of something. It brings us back to Rossini, but this is a serious observation. What we were just talking about with Faust and the three ladies and the magic flute and many operas that, quote, could give offense. And this is no criticism of Rossini, but I don't see much in the stories and the content of the Rossini operas that, quote, could give offense. Yes, there's attraction. Yes, there is, in the case of Otello, repulsion and jealousy and so on. Yes, certainly in things like Mosè in Egitto, there are political and religious dramas and so on. And Armida is just a witch. But nonetheless, maybe it's something about the way he composed the music. Maybe it's the way the librettos were written at that time. But whether comedy or tragedy, they focus on big stories. Guillaume tells certainly Semiramide in its very bizarre way is kind of like the combination of Aida and Il Trovatore of Rossini, because there are discoveries about parentage that happen, but also the big grandeur of Aida, the big grandeur of Semiramide. But, Barbara of Seville is, yes, about a young woman who's the ward of a lecherous middle-aged guy. But somehow the relationships are different. I never find, when I teach Rossini or take people to Rossini, that I have to say, well, be advised that there's the following content. Am I wrong?
It's not that you're wrong. Rossini very, very cleverly takes it away from what is wrong. Well, let's take Three in a Bed.
Yeah. Le
Three in a
Comptoir.
Bed, Comptoir. But it is hilarious because of the way the music is structured.
Including a man dressed as a nun.
Including a man that, look, all of this, the cross-dressing, all of that, the fact that if we want to look at it to find offense, the fact that the Comte gets his way with women by not the most gentle of ways, but the way it is structured and the way that hopefully you have charm, we're able to iron out those seams. Let's take a story of Le Comptoir. I was doing it at Glyndebourne. I was singing it on the tour, and so I was understudying it in the season. And on the tour, we had two conductors, and one of them was a French lady. So I was terribly intimidated by this, singing French to a French woman. And here also in lies, we'll come back to it, but the difference between singing Rossini in French and Rossini in Italian. La figlia del reggimento is a very different prospect to La fille du régiment.
And Guillaume Tell, Guglielmo Tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Asile.
Moise Pharaon.
Now, the fact that they have French titles and they were done, that's different, but they make, and Donizetti did it, Favorita, Favorita. Ange si pur is a very different prospect to Spirito Gentile. It alters the line completely. And I was talking to the French conductor about it, and I love it. So I stopped singing Rossini for many years. I stopped singing Barbiere for many years. And then I came back, and the first thing back was Cenerentola. But before that, I'd done this Comptoir, and I loved it. I just loved it. And we were talking about it, and I was talking about the seas and the way the duets are structured, and she said the difference between you and the other person is, to the other person, and this sounds like I'm patting myself on the back. I don't, but it does see the difference. So the difference between is that to him, this is a sport, and to you, it's an art form. And I never heard it said like that before, but I felt immensely proud, and also it was a lovely thing to say. To you, it's an art form, because it is. Shaping those incredibly difficult phrases with charm takes a lot of work to do. It's easier to treat it as a sport. Does that sound?
Yeah, then it's about hitting averages and home runs or baseball talk. And I mean, I that's thrilling in its way. As I said, when you have a Marilyn Horne who could bat every one of them perfectly, but also sing gorgeously,
Yeah, yeah.
that's Lagniappe. That's an extra thrill. But Rossini is all about gorgeous singing. I mean, Federica von Stade to me is a perfect example of someone who looks at it as beautiful music. Joyce Di Donato is another one who sees it as beautiful music, and whether she's singing Rosina in Barbiere or Semiramide, that's quite a change.
Yeah.
Or Daniela Barcelona, who could do comedy and tragedy. I do too. I know I love her. And so when she's in La Donna del Lago, wearing a beard and a kilt and everything that she wears, and the costuming they put her in was so ugly. And yet when she sang, that's singing, because it's really singing. And it's as if Rossini captured her soul. I was fortunate as a youngish man. I said to you that I was under the spell of Abbado when I was a student, and he was the first conductor at the new Rossini Festival in Pesaro, a kind of all-star production of Il Viaggio a Reims,
Mhm.
1984. Luca Ronconi staged. I was an assistant, and the singers we had that year, you could sort of separate into a couple of technicians, but then most of them were Italians cast by Abbado who really sang. So Enzo Dada, Lucia Valentini Tirani, uh, Katia Ricciarelli at her peak. Um, we had Samuel Ramey, Lella Kuberly. These were all singers who anyone who knows the names of Ruggero Raimondi, fantastic. But they all sang with Italianate passion, even if they were not Italians. Ramey is not an Italian. But not everyone who does that music sings it so lyrically. And what Abbado asked for in this new modern production, modern in the sense it had not been seen for more than 100 years, was that they sing it like gorgeous music and not like Rossini fireworks. And it was a revelation to people because it introduced again a style of singing that people did not associate with Gioachino. That Callas tried to in her way on Il Turco in Italia. She was not an ideal singer. But before that, we had the Sutherlands, the Sills, the Caballers, who were, they were very, very precise and thrilling with their hammering. And Sills had a certain kind of um, fire in her singing that was very exciting. Sutherland could achieve that fire, but she was more about the gorgeousness and the facility, and Caballé was about a certain romance and appeal that she had beyond the gorgeous voice and gorgeous singing. But it was more the mezzos, the Berganzas, the horns, the von Stadas, who opened the door to the kind of singing that we want to have, at least in my view.
And those
And I'll just get one
Abbado.
more thing because it
Yeah,
relates to
sorry.
you. At that time, the Rossini tenor was rare on the ground. There was Francisco Reiser, there was Rockwell Blake, there was Dalmacio Gonzalez, there were Chris Merritt, certainly, who was a different style of Rossini tenor, but very few and hard to find. And the Rockwell Blakes were very much in demand in part because he could do it very well. The young Gregory Kundi before he moved on to bigger rep. But he was wonderful in that music as a young man. But in your generation, Lawrence Brownlee, you, a few others, but there are never that many
No.
among the Rossini tenors, the way there are more Rossini sopranos and basses and baritones. So talk about the fact, please, of being in that rare group who are, I mean, you did one opera, Armida, that has 7 tenor roles. Thank you, Gioachino.
Yeah. It I'll go back to the 1984 Viaggio and what that entire era brought to us. Without that era, 84, 86, and Abbado, what Abbado did with Rossini was he cleaned the score up. He cleaned the style up. He sometimes went a little too far
Mhm.
in the cleansing of it. So, but what he was trying to get away from was the extraneous high notes, the extraneous way of holding notes, how to hold notes. So I sometimes found some of the earlier way that he was doing it a little too clinical for my soul and my ears, but we needed to go there to come back to where we then landed. But without Marilyn, I once stopped. I was in an evening to honor Federica von Stade, and Marilyn Horne was there, and I think that was the year after I came out from the audience at the Met to go on for Don Pasquale. I was in the audience, and I'd never really met Miss Horne, and so I just walked on. I walked onto the pedestal, and I wanted to thank her for giving me a career, because without Rocky, without Chris, without Sam, all those people, and Marilyn, and all the people from the Pesaro, that 1986 era, we Rossini singers of the next 20, 30, 40 years wouldn't have a career. And so I went to thank her for my career. And I started with, Miss Horne, you don't know who I am, and I just got butt out, and she said, I know exactly who you are, because you've been, and that to me was amazing. That this great,
that's true. That's Marilyn.
But without those people, we wouldn't have what we had today. So the tenor.
And by the way, I left out one other name, Juan Diego Flores, among the
Juan
current.
Diego, of course, yeah. And then you get very different tenors, and we'll come back to the tenors. So the first time I worked with William Matteuzzi, he's a voice people either love or hate. And I was once talking to him about the passaggio. I said, I was fascinated to how he negotiated. How do you negotiate the upper and the lower passaggio of these two passaggi? And he went, no, I don't have two passaggi. I have four passaggi. I have 5 voices. And I went, okay, that was too much for my brain, my tiny brain to handle. But I was so grateful, because I, as the audience will know, or may not know, but I will out myself. I am not the tallest person in the world. So I had to concentrate on other aspects of singing as well as but yeah, when I first started to sing Rossini, I was the only singer in Britain who was singing Rossini at a particular level, at the highest level. And so I was a rarity. I was a rarity in Britain, because not only was I singing Rossini, but I was also singing Donizetti. Bellini came much, much later. But I was the only one in Britain for years to be singing Rossini. That's how rare it was. And so we had Francesco Raiza and Jimenez. But
also Donna Raffanti back then. I forgot about Donna Raffanti. Yeah.
But in the cases of, and then you had Frank Lepardo, who was coming into the scene a little later, and Ramon Vargas were then coming in. And not that our voices are any way the same, or I related much more to that type of Rossini timbre than I did to the William Matteuzzi, Jimenez, Araiza. And so there you got Araiza, Matteuzzi, Jimenez, and Rocky, and Chris. 5 completely different voices.
Yeah.
So which one of them was was right. They're all right because they were all singing with their voice.
But also within the context of the Rossini operas, there are certain roles that are more suited to one or the other of those voices.
Absolutely.
When you do Otello, for example, you have three different tenors, as I recall, Rodrigo, yep. Iago, and Otello. And these are all different tenor voices, all within Rossini. When I go back and study Rossini, I go back and see who initiated the roles. Yes. And I wrote down some of them because I like to talk about them.
The Notaros, the Davides.
Andrea Notari, Giovanni David, but also there was Claudio Bonoldi, who sang in Otello. He also did some lower voice roles. And when you look at the roles, and Alfred Nuri, who sang some of the later Rossini roles, the original Arnold in Guillaume Tell. And these were all different kinds of voices. We don't have recordings, but you just have to look at what they sang to know how they sounded.
Yeah.
That David was more probably in the Rockwell Blake territory, and the Notari was maybe more in the, I don't know, Chris Merritt
territory. Chris Merritt and now Michael Spires.
Spires, yeah. And they're all different. And yet people like you and Lawrence Brownlee, and to some extent Juan Diego Flores, are called upon to sing all these roles.
Yeah.
Almost interchangeably, and they're not the same kind of role at all.
No, they're not. I mean, if in my early days, if somebody mentioned an opera, I could pretty much go on and say, if David sang it, then it was probably going to be okay for me.
Mm-hmm.
If Notaro sang it, then it was 99% true that it wasn't going to be for me.
Yep.
And don't forget that the Rossini tenor spanned two different eras. They spanned the era of the voix mixed high C, mm-hmm. and the era of the chested high C, or more bodied, full-bodied high C.
And Barry, you correct me if you think I'm wrong, or expand on it if you think I'm right. The voix mixte is something very Berliozzian.
Yes, it can be, absolutely. If you look at the roles of Iopas or Ilas,
which you sang, in Les Troyens.
This high voix mixte. Nadir is also, although a different mm-hmm. composer. L'Enfance du Christ, but especially Damnation.
Yeah.
This is very much that type of voix mixte.
What we in English call the Damnation of Faust by Hector Berlioz.
Yes. So yes, that's very much that side of it. Whereas later on, it became a more full-bodied. It's funny. There was a young tenor when I did Donna del Lago at New York City Opera. Shortly after that, the tenor who was covering me went to Pesaro as a young artist. And
let's describe Pesaro. Pesaro being Rossini's birthplace and the home of the Rossini Opera Festival, and where a lot of the archives are that store everything we know about Rossini.
And at that time, I'd never sung in Pesaro, mm-hmm. never been invited. Although because I sang, I did Viaggio a Reims in Bologna, mm-hmm. and I was both Libenskov and Belfiore. And in the nights that I was Belfiore, Juan Diego was Libenskov.
Oh, boy.
So it was very, very early on there. Where did this come from? I'd lost my thread. Sorry. What were we talking about? We were talking about
the two different eras.
Two different eras. I'll have to come back, but I'll have to come back to that when the thread comes back into my mind. But there was very much it's very much a subjective thing. Some people like the chested, some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the tenors doing Rossini now are of the, oh, I know what it was. Most of the tenors now are of the more full-bodied. Interestingly, I think Alva recorded Barbiere twice,
Mm-hmm.
and in the first recording he had the very, what the Germans call the Knödel, ha 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 ha, and in the second he lent more onto his voice.
In other words, the dumpling in the mouth.
The dumpling in the mouth or throat. So when I was doing the Donna del Lago, there was a young tenor covering me, and he went to Pesaro. And Alberto Zedda asked him who his favorite Rossini tenor was. And he'd covered me a couple of times, and he said, "Oh, Barry Banks." He says, "No, no, 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 no. Don't listen to Barry Banks sing Rossini. Barry Banks sing Rossini like Verismo."
Ah.
But if you think about it, look at the houses that I was singing Rossini in.
Yeah. Bologna's bigger.
The Met is big.
Met in Chicago are much bigger. San Francisco, Houston.
Yeah, these are all big houses which you have to fill. Yeah. And so, but latterly, of course, Alberto called on me quite a few times to do the opera seria, because for the opera seria you need depth of sound,
yep,
as well as delicacy, but you need the real depth of sound. I was 55, maybe 54, 55 before I tackled Guillaume Tell, because I didn't feel that I had the body of voice
yep,
to do it, so that when I did it, I was ready for it.
I was going to bring up Alberto Zed. I've spoken about him a lot. I loved him very much.
Yeah.
You were talking about that when Abbado made reforms in the first 2 or 3 years, then the Rossini Foundation, in effect, undertook a very long-term project directed by Alberto Zedda, but also very much by Philip Gossett.
Phil, yes, absolutely.
In which they would do the so-called critical editions of each opera that Rossini did and try to scrape away the performance practice. In other words, singer so-and-so in 1947 added music here or there because she liked how it sounded, but maybe that's not what Rossini wrote. So you have the critical edition that reflects what we think Rossini intended, and then you could have all the variations. And as part of this whole ongoing project, young people, myself included, were each taken on to work on one score. And I was taken on for Il Turco in Italia. But with Zedda, always, guiding me. It's not that I was making the changes, but I would suggest to him, I think this should stay, this should go. And then he would look at it and consult with Philip Gossett and make the decision. It was not my decision. Philip Gossett, who I knew very well, was brilliant at what he did. I'm going to say this about the Dead. Sorry, Phil. He was very competitive, and therefore he wanted always to be right about his opinions about everything. And I'm not competitive, and I certainly couldn't compete with him about Rossini, but I wouldn't want to anyway. But he sometimes would compete with Zedda, and that was problematic.
Yeah.
Zedda, I think Gossett understood Rossini the way a sports fan understands every single detail of a game, whereas Zedda felt Rossini and Rossini's spirit, and sometimes Zedda would call for things that Gossett would abhor, and they would fight terribly because ultimately they had to come up with a compromise, and it would be somewhere between the Zedda and the Gossett in terms of the critical edition result. But their work, they're both gone now, their work is what we use today in most Rossini performances around the world.
And in my experience, I worked with both Philip and Alberto, and latterly, latterly Alberto became a fan
Mhm.
because, well, for whatever reason. And Philip, I had quite a long relationship with. I was lucky enough to work on 4 edizioni provvisoria,
Mhm.
and I'm not saying that I have those scores, but I might have those scores. And Viaggio was one, because it still wasn't finished by the time we did it in Bologna.
Mhm.
Turco in Italia was very much one. Ermione was one, and I can't remember, maybe Tancredi was, but there was another one. Oh, Comtorchi, because Comtorchi didn't have a full performable edition for many years. Certainly not by the time I was first singing it. And but I remember clashing with Phil. on
Everything.
Ermione,
Yeah.
because I wouldn't do his ornaments in Reggia Borita. But I stood my ground, and he eventually understood why. The ornaments that he wrote didn't fit my voice.
Mhm.
I needed ornaments that were higher. And so, but he
And
fought
you're
and fought.
making a key point that I certainly get, and some audience members get, but please expound and expand on that because it's so important. And that's why we have all this performance practice and why Sills, Sutherland, and Calvier could sing this, and June Anderson, the same music, but it's not the same music. The ornaments.
So let's take each voice has a tessitura, so how high they are comfortable sitting at. My tessitura was very, very high, always was. So it meant that I could sit above the stave for hours, but I was still using my body, and I would get over my passaggio with body rather than with too much voix mixed. I could go over. Whereas lower sitting voices would have a different way of negotiating the passaggio, and if they were a lower sitting voice, they would probably sit a good second below mine. So someone like Rocky could go very high because he kept his as I do, kept his throat very open, and then just went up. Someone like Chris would have to do very much more of the cupola, very much more of that. And so what speaks well in your voice for clarity would be a different tessitura in my voice than it would in Chris's or even Juan Diego's or Larry's or whatever, because we sing, or certainly Araiza or Jimenez or these people. And so ornaments become very, very personal. I always made my own ornaments up. Some of the time, it would be similar to historical ornamentation, but the negotiation of it would be different. And one of the best reviews I ever got was when I did Carnegie Hermione, and it was the first time that New York had heard me do bel canto.
Yep, I was there.
And
Of course.
And it was the first time that New York had heard me do that type of bel canto.
Mhm.
And I got a review that said Mr. Banks's ornamentation were not vocal preening, but were the result of animalistic, not animalistic, but were the result of an outpouring of emotion.
Yeah.
Ornamentation should be left out totally if it doesn't mean anything. I'm hitting my head against the wall sometimes with some of the people, and that also includes appoggiatura or aggiacaturas. They've got to mean something, so that my ornaments I put into a part of the voice, my voice, that I could emote in the best possible way for that word painting. And Philip
Word
and I
painting, but also expression of the character.
Absolutely.
If a singer brings me an ornamentation and I say, "But what does it say about you pick the character? What does it say about him, Rodrigo?" If it doesn't say anything, I don't want to hear pretty singing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't need to be pretty singing. Let's take Hermione. And the way you come off that, and it becomes, that's his character.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you do what you do. Whereas in Italiana, for instance, I always used to go to the E flat in I think
it's my favorite.
because I would always because I thought I tell you how that came about. That E flat came about as a bet, and I lost the bet. And I was playing a game of pool in a bar, and the person I was playing, I can't remember what her forfeit would be, but mine was, if you lose, you put the E flat in the aria in Italiana. And I think it was the next night, and I'd not lost all evening, and I lost. So I had to put in, and that's how the E flat came to be. But it's part of his character, that exuberance.
It is. Lindoro. Lindoro is not necessarily the most charismatic character in all of Rossini by any stretch of the imagination, because the two big characters in that opera are Isabella and the Mustafa. And, he's sort of buffo, but he is tender, and he's a bit like a Don Pasquale in a way. And Isabella is just the smartest person in all of Rossini. And she runs everything, and she does it in a way that charms everyone and liberates everybody. And to me, this opera represents, remember, 1813, Europe was at war. There was a huge war going on. Rossini wrote this opera about Italian independence when there was no Italy. And Italy represented by a smart woman who was able, through not cunning, but through intelligence and resilience and adaptability and improvisation, to get out of every situation in a way that everybody felt terrific, but nonetheless she got what she wanted. And that was Rossini's augury for Italy. Well, I mean, this was the year Verdi was born. He was born in October, and the opera was in May. So he was not even born yet. And already Rossini was planting those seeds that Verdi and others would pick up. But Lindoro, nice guy, the boyfriend role, basically.
Yeah, basically the boyfriend role. But okay, we'll come back to the differences in tenors. Let's talk about the differences in mezzos. I never had the joy of doing Italiana with Steffi Blythe.
Yeah, it was terrific.
I did have the joy, however, of doing it with Olga Borodina.
Okay.
Olga Borodina.
I saw all of those. It was unforgettable.
It was like, I can only say to the audience, it was like a Rolls Royce purring at 50 miles an hour. It's some of the most perfect Rossini singing I've ever heard in my life. Per lui che adoro. And for a voice as stentorian as that, it was immensely agile.
Yeah.
in that role. And then you have Marilyn,
But I want
who's
to
a
stick to
different way.
Olga for a minute because I've spoken
Yep.
about her before on this broadcast in that role. She was not exactly a laugh riot. She was a very serious woman, but playing the role seriously, not ever reaching for a laugh, but being practical, being stern, being serious in her way. It was like Mussorgsky comes to Rossini, but it really worked. It worked beautifully
Yep.
because you can sing it like a dream, as you said, purring along, but she stated the lines as they were. She did the stage business as directed in this Pinnell production, but she didn't in any way strain for a laugh, but just the sheer beauty of the voice. Stephanie Blythe plays it as a very wise woman, and I love her performance, but it's a different thing from Olga
Yep.
Borodina, who
But
played it like a
don't think
Russian. Yeah,
don't think Olga didn't have a glint in her eye. She absolutely does.
did she? Okay.
Oh, absolutely. But in a very, very different way. Okay, I'm and the other great animal in every sense of the word, Eva Podlish,
Yes.
doing that as well. But you hit on something, Fred, that goes to the dramaturgical side, and something that I've spent my life in various composers, Donizetti, Rossini, and others, doing commedia. The best commedia is when the person treats it with utter seriousness.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if if at the end of Act One, the audience are not in absolute turmoil and tears at Adina Credimi,
Yeah.
I've done my job wrong. He's not
Elegio
a
d'amore.
he's
Yeah.
not a buffoon. He's
Mm-hmm.
not a buffoon, and he's not a
Marino.
two-dimensional character to be laughed at by the village.
Mm-hmm.
It's utter sincerity.
Yeah.
And that is how I've always approached all my comedies, with commitment,
Mm-hmm.
because then it's funny.
As Will Ferrell, the comedian actor, often said, it may be funny to the audience, but it's not funny to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Lucille
And
Ball, the same.
yeah,
Everything she did with utter seriousness.
yeah, yeah.
If she had to do, movement across a room and hit certain marks, she did it with complete seriousness and never, ever, ever mugged for a laugh,
But that's
like
what you
Vincent
work
Pearl.
out. That's what you work out in a rehearsal.
Yeah.
And the great artists that I've been lucky enough to work with, um, you watch their character grow. It's, for instance, you brought his name up very early in the afternoon. It's always fascinating to see how Simon Keenly Side
Yep.
builds a character up. Uh, and then you always leave a little bit for opening night.
Mm-hmm.
you you don't give all, but you do give. I having going back to the Cappuccilli thing of him committing from the very. I always commit from the first. The energy in the rehearsal room has to be committed.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get to that opening night, you've worked out all your shtick, but it shouldn't be shtick. It shouldn't look shtick.
Mm-hmm.
It should be an organic thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because comedy is a serious
Yeah.
thing.
They always say that tragedy is easy, comedy is hard.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
easy to die, it's not easy to get a laugh.
Yeah. And the more you do something and don't get a laugh, and you can see a cast when they've lost the audience, then the cast can then start giving or trying too hard.
Yeah.
And then they've totally lost it. It's totally gone. But going back to your different tenors, the way I
And I
sing.
left out, by the way, a
Oh,
young
sorry.
one
Yeah.
we should mention, Michele Angelini is a
Oh,
younger one.
yes. Yes. Yep.
He's very fun. He has a very busy career in Europe. He's an
Yep.
American,
Yep.
mostly in Europe, and he's doing
Yep.
very well. Yeah.
Yes, he is. He started off life doing covers at the Met also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've all done that. In
Yeah.
fact, the first cover I ever did, and the Met told me I would never do bel canto there many years ago. And then I did something, I just did something in a performance once, and I think it caught attention. And then I got my first cover, and it was Barbiere.
Mm-hmm.
And who was the Basilio cover but Sam Raimi? You know,
Cover?
yep, the cover.
Oh.
Yep, yep. And I think Joyce was the cover of Rosina as well.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people have done the covering at the Met.
The Met
And it,
does incredibly deep casting, which
yep,
is wonderful.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. But yes, every type of tenor voice can do this stuff, and that's what keeps it more alive than a lot of other composers. If you're a Puccini singer, it's dependent on your style and whether people like your timbre
Mm-hmm.
or like the way you sing passionately. Verdi's the same. It's a way of doing the style. But I don't think you have so many different types of tenor doing it as you do in Rossini.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's valid, but it also goes on vocal fashion. So the Rossini singers of the 40s and 50s probably wouldn't survive now in terms of longevity
Sure.
because of the because of the way people react to particular voices. It's so subjective. I'm just lucky that I lived through my Rossini singing when people thought it was okay.
Now, you heard me say at the very beginning in passing that I do love every single note of Rossini, and I do. And I could name certain operas such as Tancredi that I think are terrific and not done enough. But that if I only could take one, I love Guillaume Tell, but it would be Semiramide. And it's for the pure musical audacity, the fact it's longer than most of them, so it's more music. Um, it's not about anything that I care to, I mean, I could recount the story, but so what? But I just love that. To me, it's Rossini at his zenith in all the roles. Your character, the King Idreno, which is a terrible name, but but it's a great role. And Semiramide and Asur and all of them, every note, and the orchestra, the overture is one of the best. And I went to it just before the pandemic. I went to a final dress in Venice at La Fenice of Semiramide, and it was just glorious to hear it in Venice where it had premiered in that theater at La Fenice. And imagine him there, imagine him hearing the music and then going out and eating a massive meal. And um, I felt closer to him. It was conducted by Riccardo Frizza very, very beautifully.
Yeah, yeah.
It was, not an all-star cast. They were great, but it was not an all-star cast. But nonetheless, it was just so satisfying. Is there one Rossini opera that you would take away and say, this is the one that's closest to my heart? Not the best, but closest to my heart.
Wow. Wow, that's such a tough one. Um, Having been known as a Rossini singer, when people say, "What's your favorite opera ever? Your favorite role ever?" There's not even any discussion. I immediately say Tom Raquel.
Yeah. Race Progress tradition.
The Rake's Progress. I sung Semiramide many times, and invoking one of your earlier mentors. I did the Ronconi production in Naples. And by the way, to sing Rossini in the San
Naples,
Carlo,
where he wrote, I think, 9 operas for Naples.
Yeah, it was just, and to stand in his box.
Yeah.
And also go back and do Donizetti there and stand in Donizetti's box. It was just an incredible thing. Pesaro's one thing, but San Carlo for me was incredible.
People don't know, in the 1820s, let's say 1830s, Donizetti, Bellini, and Rossini were all in Naples, and Naples was the opera capital of the world in that decade. And Rossini wrote 9 operas for Naples, not all for the San Carlo, but for the city of Naples. And I'm forgetting his name now, it has a J in it, which is unusual for Italian. The man who was the head of opera in Naples had not just the San Carlo, but several theaters, and could program Donizetti here one night, Bellini there another night. Another night you would have Rossini, later on the young Verdi, but extraordinary.
And San Carlo still used the little theater in the palace.
Yeah,
which I did some Donizetti in, and it was a delightful little, but tiny stage and tiny theater. The role that made me feel humbled and think, that's it, it's done now, was Arnaud.
In William Tell.
Tell.
That is the summit of tenor singing for me. There's a couple of Wagner roles, and there's a Verdi or two, and that.
Yeah, and I felt.
And Andrea Chenier is just another in terms of tenor singing.
Yes, but I felt that I'd lived all through my Rossini years and my Rossini education to come to this point.
Yeah.
And
why? I know why, but you tell us why, because I feel that. As I said, Guillaume Tell for its absolute greatness, without question. For me, Semiramide for the overall. But for tenor singing and baritone singing as well, soprano less so, it's pretty special. Guillaume Tell.
So it has everything in terms of what you need. You need to have your technique firmly under your belt before you even begin to think about doing the role. As I told you, I think I was about 54, 55 by the time I tackled it. You have to be dramatically so secure. Your voice has to be able to go up and down in one color throughout its entire range. And the range is from something like low C or B to high C sharps. But these are not faked C sharps. This is big stuff. The dramatic arc from the beginning of Asile, where he enters the graveyard of his ancestors, to the battle cry at the end, is a massive shift.
Yeah.
And I have always thrived on pushing myself to the limit. And Arnaud made me go there in a way that none of the other roles ever did. Not that I didn't give my all, but Arnaud took it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it wasn't serving me, it was serving that. Semiramide, as you said, Semiramide has everything. But it has everything in bits. It has bits of Guillaume Tell. It has bits in incredibly. It's difficult sometimes because there is some commedia writing in there that you have to make serious. So, and I've always loved doing Semiramide. And I, of all the commedias, the one that hits my heart is Italiana.
Me too.
In terms of, but I was lucky enough to do the Concerti aria, which is controversial, and I think that is a far better aria than the one that's usually inserted. But apart from Barbiere, the one that I sang most performances, Turco in Italia.
Mm-hmm.
And I did in Europe, I must have done 50, 60, 70 performances just of the Carl Enson Uschi Hermann production in the Monet that then went to Geneva and
the
in that
character's Narciso.
Narciso, and in that production, as you've worked on the critical edition, I did all three arias.
Ah.
The one that is always cut is Io Vago e Sembianze, always. But in that production, I did all three. And I thought I'd stopped singing Rossini. I thought, okay, my Rossini days are over. Until Cecilia asked me last year to do Turco in Italia with her again in Monte Carlo, and then we took it to Vienna.
Yep.
And so I thought my days of Rossini were well and truly over, but I had such a ball. Cecilia and Alaimo, we were just having so much fun all of the time. And I was when I made my debut in Chicago, there was a production of Barbiere happening, and Gyaurov was doing his final Basilios.
Oh.
Rocky was doing his finals. Tom Allen, Figaro, was doing his last, and Flicker was doing her final. And if you added up the ages of all those people, it is probably the oldest Barbiere ever to have massed, and it was also masterly.
Yeah.
But Fred, it's heartbreaking to think that cast would never be cast today.
Because of the way they sang or the way they looked?
Because of the way they now look, and they're too old for the roles.
Yeah, I would still hear Thomas Allen.
Sorry?
And I would still hear Thomas Allen as
absolutely.
anything
absolutely.
he wants to do.
Absolutely. But I heard a 62-year-old Stuart Burroughs do Tamino when Covent Garden were on tour, and it was fantastic.
Yeah.
But going back to Arnold, it pushed me to my limit and really sated everything dramatically and musically that I ever wanted. It was just a joy.
I think you could still do it.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. But whether or not
there may be 5 guys in the world who can touch it at all.
Well, at that time there was certainly, and now unfortunately a couple of those have gone by the wayside. Yeah. So it just goes to show that these roles should be tackled with great caution. Great caution. There was, you probably know the book, but when I was at college, there was a book out called Bravissimo. And it was interviews. It was a Greek authoress,
Ariana Stassinopoulos,
in which they interviewed all the great tenors, baritones, bass baritones, and basses. And you know where I'm going to go. Corelli said, if you don't have a Radames, don't do the opera. Get your tenor to do Traviata, then get them to do this role, and after that, you will have a Radames for the next 10, 15 years. And
We don't do that now.
We don't do it
We
anymore.
have women who are pushed into Aida when they're 28 years old,
And this is the problem.
and men doing Siegmund when they're 35.
And we have no companies, make no doubt about this, you singers out there. Companies will eat you up and spit you out and not care whether you're not singing in 5 years or not.
Mhm.
There
But
is
that's
no
not
company
new.
out there.
When I
Sorry?
worked at the Met in the 80s as regarded Helden tenors, the Met would eat them up and spit them out. There was no effort. I mean, we were lucky to have the Vickers and the Hepners and so on, who did have longevity and, challenges, but longevity. But there were other men of less distinction or less gifts, fewer gifts, who they'd be there for 5 years and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm fighting that with the younger generation. I said, do you not want to be around? But a lot of them think they're in it for very quick money and then they'll get out.
Well, they have a lot of bills to pay. I mean, the life of a young singer, especially lower voiced men, but all singers, is that they have to wait for a while, and they've built up all these bills, and they go for classes and coachings and clothing, and if they have families, they have to support their families, and if they're American or live in a country that doesn't have a lot of social services, um, they move to Germany if they're lucky, or Austria, or certain places where they can support their families, Denmark, Sweden, um, the UK in some ways, but not every way. And therefore, the young American singer arrives with huge debts when he's 30
And
or
it's
she's 30.
heartbreaking. It's
Yeah.
heartbreaking. Yeah, I left college with no debt because I came from a very, very poor family. I had a free ride.
Yeah.
And then I won scholarships. Peter Moores was very generous to me. And I want to give a shout out to Peter Moores, because without Peter Moores, we wouldn't have half of the opera rara recordings or any of the opera
Mm-hmm.
in English Chandos recordings. So Peter gave me money to stay on at college, to stay out of the big bad world for an extra year.
Mm-hmm.
And because I grew up incredibly poor and never had any money, I started to sing quite a lot in oratorios. In that part of England, every little village has a choral society, and they all do oratorios. So
Mm-hmm.
I used to put the 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 pounds. I squirreled it all away, and I knew what would happen. A certain very big opera company in England said I would never have a career because I was too small. And so I put away all of my money, and I went to the National Opera Studio, and here's where Gioachino comes back. I was the only one in the opera studio not to have any work when I left the opera studio. We did the final showings, and I sang beginning of Don Giovanni, and I did Don Pasquale. It's the first time I had the guts to do. I was doing the duet with the incredible English bass Clive Bailey,
Mm-hmm.
and the next day I got my first barbiere, and then I got my second barbiere and third barbiere. So my first three contracts out of the National Opera Studio was barbiere. And I put all my money aside for 1 year, and I gave myself 1 year, and I said, if I don't get the roles that I want at the end of that 1 year, then I will take all the character roles that come my way,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously nobody will employ me. And just at the end of that first year, all those that it started in. And because there were no other Rossini or Italian singers, and I made my debut at Covent Garden as Beppe, I was on the map as an Italian singer. And then it just slowly worked out for me. But I decided if at the end of the year, then I had nothing, I would then do character roles. And I remember Gérard Mortier. I auditioned for him, and I did the magic flute for him, and he gave me a lot of beautiful roles. He asked me to audition to Sholti because he wanted me to sing Fenton in their new production.
Falstaff. Yep.
And so I went to Sholti's house in London, and I was let in by Charles, his publicist, and I knew as soon as I walked into Sholti's studio, I knew I hadn't got the gig. I just knew. His eyes glazed, and his face altered, and so I sang This Wildnis, and
from the magic flute. Yeah,
from the magic flute, and it was my calling card, and it went well. So then I sang Fenton, and it luckily went well. And then Sholti said to me, I'd like you to come sing Bardolfo for me. And I went, no, maestro, I'm auditioning for Fenton. He said, but if I give you Fenton, I have to get a small minetta. So he actually said that. And he said, and Tamino, I would have to give you a small Tamino. And luckily,
Pamina.
Pamina, yes. And I said to him, which is exactly what Brussels and Salzburg have done. They've got me a small Pamina. And he burst out laughing and smacked me on the back and said, you come sing for me again. and that was the production that Juan Diego got the Fenton in.
Yeah.
But Sholti only saw me as a character tenor because of my size.
So, you're not the only male singer in opera. There's also the other side of the equation that you have Daniela Barcelona, who's very, very tall. And there are people who won't cast her because you're too tall to sing with this male singer or other female in her case. I don't know. I give up. People of all sizes and shapes are attracted to one another, and that's the end of that.
Absolutely.
And I don't see where someone has to be of equivalent size unless you're doing Don Giovanni Leporello and things where there has to be some size related thing. Otherwise, not at all.
And some of my most joyous memories are doing Italiana with Daniela.
Yeah.
We did Italiana together.
Yeah.
And also we did the Semiramide at the Royal Albert Hall. And we were staying, I don't know why they'd done this, but we were staying in apartments on the other side of London to the Albert Hall. And Daniela and I got a taxi together, and within 1 mile we hit traffic. Oh, yeah. And we knew we were in terrible trouble. We weren't going to get there on time. And I just looked at her and she looked at me, and we just burst out laughing. And there's a joyous photograph that I sometimes post on Facebook of me and her in the taxi, just howling with laughter. Very gracious colleague. And this hasn't always been the case with tall colleagues. As soon as she got near me, it wasn't that she did anything. She refused to use her full height to get comic effect.
Yep.
And therein lies the difference between a great colleague and a colleague. She never did it. She had such respect, or she has. So I love her to bits.
I think I was among the people who first, I won't say discovered, but recognized her specialness very early in her career. And I just went up to her and I said, I'm going to be following you wherever you go, and you really got it. And she does. She's a wonderful artist, and she's beginning to do Verdi's and
Yep, yep.
Santuzzas even, and it's growing well.
But I look at others in my college, like when we were doing the Turco with Turco in Monte Carlo and Vienna, and Nicola Alaimo.
Alimo, yep.
Um, he was big, and
Yep.
he wasn't getting cast for anything that wasn't a buffo role. And
Right.
now he's because he's a glorious singer,
Yeah.
beautiful voice,
Hmm.
and now but it's boring to have to change people's minds, though. It means
Yeah.
your mind isn't on the job that you should be doing.
But also because, when I talk to audiences, as I do constantly, or universities, and they say to me, well, I just can't believe her or him as a couple, and they're not romantic and so on. And there's a very famous thing that Mick Jagger at the beginning of his career did, where some old middle-aged British guy said to him, why don't you get a haircut? And Mick Jagger said, what, it looked like you?
Yep, 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 yep.
And that was not a bad Mick Jagger imitation.
Yeah.
But the point is, why do people think that they're the paragons of romanticism or gorgeousness, or that only people who look like Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman fall in love?
Shallowness.
Yeah, yeah,
Shallow character. It's got to be.
yeah.
I did. We mentioned it earlier on. I did the Magic Flute with Gerald Findlay and Amanda Rucroft and a whole host of others. And we had it was at Glyndebourne, and we had a party afterwards. And a very snotty woman decided she was going to tell me. She hated the production because it was Peter Sellers, hated it, and she then stood there and told me why nobody would ever fall in love with me. How can you be singing against her? Because I mean, it's just ridiculous. That wouldn't happen in real life. I mean, I wouldn't marry someone as short as you. And I'm thinking, and it was at her house, so I couldn't tell her exactly what I wanted to say to her. But what also gives people that gall to say those things. Obviously, they don't care how they're hurting people or what they think. They don't think about what they're saying.
That's why my favorite role for women is Electra. No one ever says to her, you have to be pretty. You just have to sing. And if you can sing that, it doesn't matter what you look like. And
Yeah,
but I mean, I back, 70, 80 years ago, you would have the pretty ladies like Lily Pons and so on, but you didn't have to be pretty. You had to be vocally persuasive and compelling. A Carmen does not have to be a beautiful woman at all. The Toreador does not have, I mean, it helps if he has a nice physique to wear those, Spanish pants. But basically, Don Jose, if he looks like John Vickers, okay. If he sounds like John Vickers, then very okay. But people still, I think in our more visual age where everything is on camera, people think that opera is about that. And
but
opera
that's been
can
going.
be, yeah,
But that's been going on since the mid 1980s, since the advent of videos.
yeah, oh, I know.
A lot of those Rai Uno videos and whatever the arte,
Arte.
uh, they they started doing that from the early to mid 80s, and that has been prevalent all the way through.
Yeah.
So We've
But
had
you
to
know,
fight that for a
the
very
Met,
long
I
time.
mean, in the Met, I worked there in the 80s and we did things like Simone Boccanegra. We had Cheryl Milnes and Anna Tomova Sintov in Boccanegra. And Milnes is a handsome man, but you went to those to hear them sing. We did Don Carlo in 83, and we had Domingo and Grace Bumbry and Shirley Ferret and Paul Plishka and Louis Quilico and people like that. And, you know, some of them were very nice looking people, but you went to hear them sing. And, you know, later the Met evolved into being more looks oriented. But, you know, at least in the 80s, the videos we made then, our ring cycle was never based on how they looked. It was based on the fact that the ring cycle told the story.
Yeah,
And
it's been
Tatiana,
very
I mean, I remember that
sorry.
Marilyn went on a radical diet when she did Isabella because she really wanted to be slimmer because she knew that this would be documented for all eternity. And she was very slim in that opera, that production.
Yeah.
But I don't know. You know, Barry, you officially have claimed the record for my longest conversation.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
But
I'm not complaining. I'm not, it's been a delight.
I I want to hit on the Wagner very quickly. It's been very interesting for me to start in the Wagner world
Are
because
you doing Mima?
I'm doing Mima.
Yeah.
And I just did it in LA with Dudamel and the LA Phil, and I've been doing it a while. Two things strike me, and it started. I did Guralida in Spain with Simon O'Neill and Karen Cargill and all the big Wagner singers. Um, and all the Wagner I've done since then, this has hit me. They're the most normal, unneurotic
They are.
singers that you could ever wish to meet. And it's because we're all in the Maya together. And everybody knows how difficult it is just to get through these roles. And it's a breath of fresh air.
Wagner
I
singers and Wagner audiences are the best. I hate to say this as a Rossini lover, but it's true. I
absolutely.
mean, I am a Wagnerite too, and I teach it all the time. But you know, you always say what nice people they are and how supportive they are, and you know, Heldenschwester. And if one Helden soprano gets sick, another one comes in, they're grateful. There's no competition. You know, they get along, go along.
Yeah. And as you know, as we said, it's subjective, but going back to Gioachino and his birthday, um, and I reflect on how incredibly lucky I am as a singer to have been associated with not just him, but other composers as well throughout my career. I'm 63 now,
Mhm.
and I've been doing this for 40 years. And I'm known as an exponent of Rossini, and that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
That's and I'm lucky, and I'm
Mhm.
my life has been enhanced because of this.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
with that, my friend, I know you and I can continue, but
yeah,
happy birthday, day late, Gioachino. You're
happy
58
birthday.
and you're looking good. So, Barry, that means that you at 63 and I is older than that. We're older than Gioachino,
There you go.
and we're going to keep getting older, and he won't. And
Hopefully,
that's the remarkable thing about
yeah,
Gioachino
yeah.
is that he's forever young.
And it will be so interesting to look down in 50 years and see where the flavor of Rossini singing has gone, because it's ever alive. It's always transforming into something else.
I'm glad to know that you're you're going to be looking down. I might be looking up.
I think no, in all honesty, it's probably up for me too.
Barry Banks, thank you so much for
Well, thank you,
celebrating
Fred.
Rossini and so much more
Thank you.
today.
And
And
so
I look
lovely
forward to,
to to talk to you. And I'm just around the corner from NYU. Let's have lunch.
I'd love to do that.
Okay,
Take
lots
care.
of love.
You
Okay,
too. Bye
bye
bye.
bye. Bye bye.